action potential, like I just showed you that spinal reflex, that's what this is referring to. An action potential that reaches the spinal cord in a spinal reflex. The spinal cord is doing the integration, right? Now some sensations just go, they might go to the brain stem or other subconscious parts of the brain. One place they're going to arrive at is the brain stem first, and then possibly other parts of the brain. And they're involved in autonomic, possibly autonomic reflexes and things like that. For example, you have in the brain stem, you have centers that control breathing, centers that control heart rate and things like that, centers that control things like vomiting and coughing. So there is, subconscious control or subconscious processing happening in the brain stem and the hypothalamus and places like that. And then the cerebral cortex is where you would have conscious perception of certain sensations that you're aware of, that you're consciously aware of. Okay, so that's just showing you the spinal cord. I've got to fix that picture. Okay. All right, I think I've already said this. So one thing you want to keep in mind is, though, you're sensing things in the sensory receptor, and it feels like you're feeling that thing in that part of the body. Like I'm touching here, it feels like I'm touching there, but it's really my brain telling me that. That's where the perception is happening. So my brain is telling me I'm touching my hand, or I'm feeling cold, or I am seeing what, a classroom of people. It's the brain that's really creating all those perceptions that you have. And while it feels like it's happening in that sensory structure, it's really all happening in the brain. It's kind of a weird concept, but that's the case. Your brain is what's seeing things, that's allowing you to see. So your eyes are just receiving the information. They're sending it to those processors, those integrating interneurons. They're the ones that are allowing you to see what you see. And also because you're tying it in with parts of your brain that deal with memory. So you recognize what you see. You recognize people's faces, or you recognize a bird or a dog. You know what you're seeing. So that ties in with memory and things like that. Any questions about all of that so far? Now, one other way of classifying sensory receptors is by the microscopic structure of those receptors. There are three types of receptors, basically. And I'm going to show you a picture of this in just a moment, but there's free nerve endings. These are exposed dendrites. I say exposed in whatever organ they're in. They're not sticking out of your skin, but these are dendrites that are in structures or in the skin or in other places that are just, in a sense, exposed. They're not covered up by anything. And so pain or nociception, thermoreception, heat and cold reception, in other words, itching, tickling, and some touch reception. It depends on there's different kinds of touch receptors. Some of them are free nerve endings. And then there's encapsulated nerve endings. These have a connective tissue capsule around the sensory neuron and or around the receptor. Pacinian corpuscles, which are pressure receptors deep in your skin, are encapsulated. Some touch receptors are encapsulated. And then there's separate receptor cells that are stimulated, and they in turn stimulate the sensory neuron. So sometimes you have separate receptor cells that are separate from the sensory neuron. They're the ones who get stimulated, and in response, they in turn stimulate the sensory receptor. And I'll be showing you examples of that. But let me back up for just a moment to that picture there. When we talk about encapsulated receptors, that's an example of an encapsulated receptor. This is a Pacinian corpuscle. We're going to be seeing that again, but just to show you an example, there's an example. So there's a couple pictures of these. Well, first of all, let's look at this picture again. Remember that most sensory neurons are unipolar, particularly in the general sensations. Some special sense organs have bipolar. We'll see those in places like the retina of the eye and inside your nose. That when we get to special senses, we'll see some examples of those. But most sensory neurons are unipolar, and up here at the top, those nerve endings there at the top are all branching dendrites, and that's where the receptors are, or they are associated with receptor cells. So this is where sensory stimulation happens, and then when you transduce that sensation to a depolarizing graded potential, that can generate an action potential here, which is then propagated down the axon all the way to the very tips here, the synaptic end bulbs. And from there, the neuron is going to release neurotransmitters that stimulate an interneuron somewhere in the central nervous system. So this would be out in the peripheral nervous system. This would be, in some structure, and then this is running through a nerve to the central nervous system. At this point, you're going to be inside the brain, sending signals to interneurons, which then process that information. Now, very quickly, bipolar neurons still, these dendrites up here are where sensation happens. The depolarizing graded potential would travel down here, all the way down to the trigger zone here. That's where the action potential gets generated and then propagated down that way. So the axon and dendrites are on opposite sides of the cell body in that type of neuron. Yeah?
What do you mean when you say the dendrites are exposed?
Well, exposed, I'll show you in just a second. This is, I thought I had another picture. Where is it? Well, maybe I'm not there yet. Okay, I'll be showing you another picture, but this picture does show some of that. These are showing different kinds of sensory neurons in the skin. They're all unipolar. Notice they all have a little structure connecting them to the axon. So these are all unipolar neurons. The ones that are exposed, or what we call free nerve endings, that's what we mean. In fact, the picture here is essentially free nerve endings. Now, free nerve endings, when I say exposed, it just means they're not encapsulated. They're not in a capsule. So they're exposed in that sense. They're just there in the skin, or they're in whatever structure they're in. Yeah.
Does the capsule serve any type of purpose? Like, does it enhance the
Yeah, that's a
touch
good
receptor?
question. I'm gonna have to look into that because I'm not sure. It may be just a protective thing, but whether it enhances the sensation or whether it helps in stimulating it, I don't know, because it doesn't seem like it would. I'd have to look into why they have those. Some do and some don't, but why they have them and some don't, I'll have to look into that. But they are basically like layers of connective tissue, those encapsulated ones like that. One at the top, that's one of the touch receptors in the dermis. It's called a Meissner's corpuscle, and this kind of corpuscle is referring to that capsule. Yes?
Can you please explain again, like microscopic structures, like the differences and stuff again?
Well, these are the microscopic structures. That's what they mean. In other words, you can classify sensory receptors by whether they are free nerve endings like this, where they have free nerve endings that are exposed nerve endings, or whether their sensory receptors are covered in a capsule, they're encapsulated, in other words, or whether they're associated with a separate sensory cell, a receptor cell. So those, that, and that are three microscopic versions of a receptor. Does that make sense? So this is showing those microscopic versions. So free nerve endings, encapsulated nerve endings, and receptor cells. Those are the three if you're looking at the microscopic level, those are the three types of neurons. And this is just showing you in the skin. It's not showing you all the examples, but the top one is encapsulated. It's called, like I said, it's called the Meissner's corpuscle. If you look at the top, you might be able to see that label. The nerve, this is the dendrite up here. They're not as branching as you would see like here, but those dendrites are covered in layers. It almost looks like onion, layers of an onion around, like say this is the receptor, this is the dendrite, it's covered in layers, like layers of an onion. And that's where the receptor is, that's where it gets stimulated. Yeah?
So what does the dendrites mean to do for the nerve cell?
What do the dendrites do?
No, like where it's encapsulated, what does that do for the nerve?
Well, that's what she was asking. I think it's primarily a protective covering. Whether it helps in the function, I'd have to look into that, because it may help with functioning, but that I'm not positive about. I need to find out more about those, why they're encapsulated. Yeah.
So most sensory neurons have exposed dendrites.
Pressure on the capsule
I would
as
say
well
most of them,
triggers
well, I
the
don't
nerve
know.
or something.
Yeah, I'd say most are the exposed or the free nerve endings, but I may be misspeaking, but I'm pretty sure it's mostly that type, yeah.
Are unipolar neurons the only ones that have exposed ones? or-
No, these are all unipolar. All of these are unipolar. Yeah, these are all unipolar. Now, they're not showing any bipolar examples in this case. But these are all unipolar, but we'll see, some examples of bipolar neurons when we get to the special senses, and we'll worry about them then because there's different varieties of those as well. The encapsulated ones, I don't know if there's any encapsulated ones in the special senses. I can't think of any. But in the special senses, you've either got these or these, and we'll see that when we get to them. We'll worry about those a little bit later. But this is just showing you how sensory neurons at the microscopic structural level, what the receptor parts are. And so the capsule, and I'll find out more about whether it helps with functioning. All I know is it helps with protecting those nerve endings, but there may be more to it than that. And so it's hard to point that far up, but let me just do it over here. So right here is where, in this case, it's a touch receptor. So it's going to detect touch sensations, and I think it also detects vibration as well. And so it gets stimulated, and when it gets stimulated, it generates a depolarizing graded potential that travels down the dendrite. When it hits the trigger zone, if it's a strong enough stimulus, it will generate an action potential that gets propagated down the axon by saltatory conduction, down to the synaptic end bulbs, and these are going to synapse with interneurons. Okay, so that's one example of an encapsulated neuron, and I'll show you these in another picture as well. Here's another encapsulated one. It's a pressure receptor. This is the Pacinian corpuscle. It's deeper in the skin, deeper in the dermis. This is more of a superficial type of neuron. This is more of a deeper neuron in the dermis of the skin. And it detects deeper pressure sensations. When you push down on your skin, you're going to stimulate those guys. Some of them even go down into the subcutaneous layer. You also have these in internal organs. Some of your internal organs have Pacinian corpuscles, so they can detect, internal pressure. There's a lot of pressure on the abdomen and things like that. But they also, they're dendrite, their sensory receptors, which are part of the dendrite, are in the capsule, and then this is the axon right here. Now, free nerve endings, you can see the branching dendrites. These are basically like what they're showing you here. Those are just, they don't have any capsule around them. They're just, they're in the tissue, whatever tissue they're found in. And pain receptors, nociceptors, those are free nerve endings. Also, thermoreceptors, which are temperature receptors. Itch receptors, believe it or not, you have itch receptors, which often respond to certain chemicals that are released when you're itching. There are certain inflammatory chemicals that cause itching. Real quick, tickle receptors. All of these are some examples of those free nerve endings. Yeah.
So just to be clear, the separate receptor cells aren't actually part of the neuron itself.
Right. These guys, and I'll show you a picture of them later, these are little bitty cells that are right next to the nerve end, or right next to the dendrites. They are what you stimulate, which they in turn will stimulate the dendrite. We'll talk about how they do that. That'll what we'll talk about on next Tuesday's lecture. So we will come back to